In the blink of an eye, Sidney Powell's life took a devastating turn. Once a straight-A student, an all-American kid, and a young woman who had never been in trouble, she became a convicted murderer. The courtroom echoed with the judge's solemn words.
On count one, ma'am, I sentence you to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in the Ohio Department of Corrections.
How did this promising young woman's life spiral so catastrophically out of control that she would take the life of her own mother? The story of Sidney Powell is one of tragedy, mental illness, and a family shattered by unimaginable loss. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for in-depth coverage of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the dark side of history. The all-American girl with a bright future. Before that fateful day, Sidney Powell was the epitome of success and promise. She was an honor student, a varsity soccer player, and a mentor to her peers. Her mother, Brenda Powell, was her best friend and confidant. Brenda, a 50-year-old counselor at Akron Children's Hospital, dedicated her life to helping pediatric cancer patients and their families. The bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. Sidney was Brenda's mini-me, and Brenda was Sidney's rock. They shared everything, from dreams to daily struggles. But on Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, that bond was violently severed when Sidney killed her mother in a shocking and brutal act. The unraveling of a promising life. The cracks in Sidney's seemingly perfect life began to show during her time at the University of Mount Union in Alliance, Ohio. At 19 years old, Sidney's grades began to slip, and by December, she was suspended and eventually kicked off campus. Yet she kept this devastating news from her parents and friends. For months, she lived a double life, pretending to still be a student while secretly staying in local hotels. Her roommates and closest friends had no idea of the turmoil she was facing. She was laughing, having fun, and even claimed she had gotten jobs, one friend recalled. She seemed fine. But Sidney was far from fine. By the time her parents discovered the truth, it was too late. On the morning of March 3rd, 2020, Steve Powell, Sidney's father, tried to pay her tuition bill, only to find himself locked out of the university's parent portal. A call to the school revealed the shocking truth. Sidney was no longer enrolled. A fateful confrontation. Using the family's location-sharing app, Steve saw that Sidney was at home. He left work immediately, desperate for answers. When he arrived, he confronted Sidney, who broke down in tears. Recognizing that Brenda was better equipped to handle the situation, Steve called his wife and left the house. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. Brenda had just gotten on the phone with university officials when the line went dead. On the other end, officials heard thumping, shrieking, and then silence. When they called back, Sidney answered, pretending to be her mother. "Sidney, is that you?" they asked. The phone went dead. When police arrived at the Powell home, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Brenda Powell lay in a pool of blood, brutally stabbed 30 times and struck multiple times in the head with an iron skillet. Sidney, covered in blood, was in a state of hysteria. Sidney had killed her mother. The aftermath, a family torn apart. For Steve Powell, the news of his wife's death was devastating. The look on Steve's face was something you can't describe. Hours later, Sidney was charged with Brenda's murder. Despite the horror of the crime, the Powell family rallied around Sidney, believing that mental illness had played a role in her actions. The family pleaded with prosecutors, arguing that Sidney suffered from schizophrenia and needed treatment, not punishment. But the legal system moved forward, and in October 2023, Sidney's trial began. The trial was a media sensation, with the nation watching as the Powell family's private tragedy played out in public. For Steve Powell, the verdict was a crushing blow.
It's almost unbreakable. They really were.
They were unbreakable, really close.
They were really close.
The The story of Sidney Powell is a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly lives can unravel. It's a tale of mental illness, family love, and the search for redemption. While the legal system has spoken, the Powell family's journey is far from over. They continue to fight for Sidney, hoping that one day she will find peace and healing. As Steve Powell put it, there's value in what she's doing, and her family loves her. In the end, this tragic case leaves us with more questions than answers. How could a young woman with so much promise commit such a heinous act? What role did mental illness play in her actions? And how does a family move forward after such a devastating loss? These are the questions that haunt the Powell family, and all of us, as we grapple with the complexities of this heartbreaking story. The psychological turmoil, a deeper dive. Sidney's descent into violence didn't happen overnight. Mental health experts who evaluated her during the trial pointed to a combination of factors that may have contributed to her breakdown. Her inability to cope with academic failure, coupled with the fear of disappointing her parents, may have exacerbated her condition. Sidney had become increasingly withdrawn, often spending hours alone in her room. She would sometimes speak incoherently, jumping from one topic to another without logical connections. At the time, these behaviors were dismissed as stress or typical teenage moodiness. The legal battle, justice versus mercy. The trial itself was a battleground between justice and mercy. Prosecutors argued that Sidney's actions were premeditated, pointing to her attempt to stage a break-in as evidence of her awareness of the crime's wrongfulness. Psychiatrists testified that Sidney was experiencing a psychotic episode at the time of the murder, rendering her incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. For Steve Powell, the trial was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he wanted justice for his wife, Brenda, whose life was tragically cut short. On the other hand, he couldn't bear the thought of losing his daughter to the prison system. In the aftermath of the trial, Steve has become an advocate for mental health reform. He has spoken publicly about the need for better resources and support for families dealing with mental illness. The story of Sidney Powell serves as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness. It underscores the importance of recognizing the signs of mental health struggles and seeking help before it's too late. For the Powell family, the road to healing will be long and arduous. But through their pain, they have found a renewed sense of purpose to advocate for change and to ensure that no other family has to endure what they have. In the end, Sidney's story is not just about a crime or a trial. It's about the fragility of the human mind, the strength of family bonds, and the enduring hope for redemption. As Steve Powell put it, we may never fully understand what happened that day, but we can choose to move forward with love, compassion, and a commitment to making things better. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to never miss an update. Until next time.